kind of off-the-wall, crazy, random question that comes out of absolutely nowhere. And this was exactly one of those days. I'm sitting there on the couch and I'm talking to Elijah, and all of a sudden Judah walks up to me and says, "Morgan, I got a question for you." He says, "If you could be born in any decade, what decade would you choose?" It's like, Judah, where do you even come up with that question? Okay, like, who are you, right? Like, you're a child of like the late 2000s, okay? Why are you asking me this question? But it got me thinking, and I started thinking about it, and I just kept on coming back to my childhood, the 90s. I mean, come on, it was like one of the greatest times. Why? Because it's what I am familiar with. It's what I know. There will be no time in history that was greater than the days of Super Nintendo. You know what I mean? It was just like, when you have Super Nintendo, that's all that matters in the world. I will never forget the days of Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers. And the inner 10-year-old child in me came out when the new Power Rangers movie came out last year. I took my wife, we went out and saw it. The first night, there was no one else in the theater. I didn't care. It was amazing, okay? I'll never forget my Pog collection. You guys remember Pogs? I mean, they were just amazing. Who knew that little pieces of cardboard could be so fun? I'll never forget my CD player that was larger than my lunchbox that I had to carry around like a server waiting tables, otherwise it would skip every 5 seconds, right? Like, it was what I knew, it was what I was familiar with. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that most people would probably say that their favorite decade to be born or raised in as a child was probably the decade that they grew up in. Why? Because it's what you know. The reality is that when we're born, we enter into whatever the culture of that day is. We can't control that, we can't change that, we just become familiar with whatever it is. As I got older, it wasn't just the things that I played with that were so different than today. It was all the things you have to learn about life. For me, dating etiquette was this whole new thing that I had to learn about. It was different then, even than it is today. Dating etiquette when I was a teenager was like, okay, you find a girl across the classroom that you really like, and you write a note, and it says, "Do you like me?" Check yes or check no, right? And then you fold that piece of paper into like 5,000 pieces of folded paper, and then you send it through about 17 girls in your classroom, and somehow makes it to the destination, right? And then you pray hellfire and brimstone that she checks yes, right? And if she checks yes, then this kind of avalanche falls that includes you asking your mom if you can go pick up random girl, and then you take random girl to the movie theater. It's the most awkward car ride of your entire life because your mom brings up some story about when you were a baby, right? And then you get to the movie theater and you sit next to this girl for an hour and a half. You don't say anything. There's no reason for you to be there together. You just are because it's a date, right? And then your mom, if she's like my mom, is sitting in the back of the theater just watching you the whole time, right? That was dating etiquette. And now today, it's totally different. Today, you post a picture on a website, you post your picture on an app, and you just go shopping for a boyfriend or a girlfriend, right? Like, gone are the days of check yes or check no. We live in the world of swipe left, swipe right, okay? That is just the reality of the day that we live in today. The way we do relationships in our culture is normal to us, but historically, it's completely abnormal. It's also totally abnormal globally. Different cultures have different norms for dating. Most people in the world don't do relationships, let alone dating, the way that we do here in the West. And it's also not normal biblically. Today we're going to look at the beginning of this romantic relationship between Ruth and this stud named Boaz. And as we dive in, I think that regardless of where you sit in this room today, regardless of what you came in today as, maybe you're single, maybe you're married, maybe you're divorced, maybe you've never been in a relationship before, I think that there are some questions that you can begin to ask yourselves as we read through this story today. If you're in your teens, you should be asking yourself questions like, what are my convictions about relationships? Should I be dating as a junior high or a senior high student because, well, that's what I see in every Disney drama movie, right? I have a 6- and a 9-year-old niece living with me right now. I'm very up to date on Disney relevance, okay? If you're here and you're single in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you may need to begin to ask yourself questions like, is the way that I'm approaching dating healthy? To the way that I view relationships, is that healthy? Am I the person now who's going to be best fit for a relationship with somebody else. If you're married or even divorced, were the things that you did in the beginning of your relationship, have they led to challenges down the road? Maybe challenges that you are experiencing today are, unfortunately, the harvest of seeds that you sowed early on in your relationship. Those that are parents and grandparents, what role do you have in your kids and your grandkids' romantic relationships? Dating in our culture is actually a relatively new phenomenon. Historically, there were prearranged marriages, and there were these things called courting. And the word dating actually originated in 1896 to refer to a man going out with a woman of the night. We won't get into that, but let your imagination wander. But early in the 1900s, people didn't practice dating, they practiced courting. I know I look old, I wasn't alive, I just researched this, okay? A young man would spend time with the family, get to know them, they would get to know the siblings and the parents and the grandparents. And in the early 1900s, the first women's-only magazine came out. Okay, this is when things began to change. It was called Ladies' Home Journal. Actually, that's a lie. I found out that that's an actual real magazine right now, but that's supposed to be a funny joke. But immediately, people started picking up this magazine, and they started reading it, and it was the first time in the history of our culture where there was an industry that was telling women how they should dress, what clothes to wear, what makeup to purchase. It was telling them what new styles were coming out. The first top 10 list of ways to attract a male were probably listed somewhere in that magazine. In the 1920s, dating and relationships took another turn because of urbanization. Cities came into existence, and all of these social gathering points were now created. Restaurants, bars, movie theaters, dance clubs. And so because of this, the focus of social relationships was moved out of the home and into the cities. In the 1930s, we get what changed everything: the automotive industry. Because all of a sudden now, dating and relationships, man, we've gone mobile, right? Like, now all bets are off. We don't know what's happening anymore. This changes everything, because now a guy picks up a girl, and rather than spending time at that girl's house, he takes her wherever he wants. I can guarantee you that if you were a young man in that day, when you bought a car, you were not picking up a girl to take her to a Bible study, okay? I'm just assuming that that was probably not what was happening. This is really the beginning of modern day dating. In the 1940s, dating becomes more popular. It was in this decade that the concept of a bachelor came about. Not the TV show, but actually in reference to like a man that was ready to be dated. And it all of a sudden became a competition to find a better date, to find a more handsome date, to find a more beautiful person to date. In the 60s, the feminist movement came. The sexual revolution movement came. In the 70s, birth control and no-fault divorce and abortion came into the picture. You see, we are born into the culture where now all of this is the new normal. It doesn't matter when you're born, but whatever happened before you, you come into the world, and what you come into is the new normal. Today, the majority of adults are single. Pastor Brandon shared with us some just incredible statistics last week that over half of singles will cohabitate within their lifetime. And out of every 10, 9 of them will lead to marriage, but the majority will lead to marriages and divorce. Being a youth pastor for so many years, been a youth pastor, a youth leader here at Caney Creek for 10 years now, I've watched students come in year after year after year, and it's been amazing to watch the same trends continue as these young people graduate, move on to college, and get married and move on in life. You see, because kids are born into this world, and they think that what they see, what they hear, is what is normal. It's what they're familiar with when it comes to dating and relationships. And can I tell you that this isn't historically normal in the grand scheme of time? This is all very recent. And in addition, biblically, this is not necessarily what God desires for us. God's roadmap to success in relationships, in vocation, in mission, in our life has been the same for thousands of years, and it's mapped out in the pages of this book. He's been speaking the same thing for years and years and years. And if I could put it in a nutshell, what this roadmap to success looks like, and I'll begin to map this out in the message, it's this in three things. The roadmap for successful relationships, in a nutshell, is this: to follow God's will, to seek God's confirmation, and to wait for God's timing. And we see this all take place in this book of Ruth. Let me catch you up to speed. Elimelech, that's a hard name to say. Elimelech has married Naomi. And this Israel faces this famine, and Elimelech makes this bold, questionable decision to pick up his family and move to Moab. They move away from God's presence. They move away from God's people. His two sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Never name your daughter Orpah. They don't share the same faith. They don't share the same beliefs. They don't share the same culture. Elimelech and the two boys tragically pass away, leaving 3 widowed, hopeless women. And so Naomi, in desperation, decides to move back to Israel, to move back to God's people and back to God's presence. And she leaves broken and hurting and bitter. Orpah goes back to her family, and Ruth decides to travel with Naomi to Israel. And Ruth and Naomi end up back in Bethlehem, destitute, broke, homeless, hungry, and they're trying to figure out how to get enough food to just survive. She's searching to find margins in the harvest. Ruth goes out and tries to find food for her family. And as Providence would have it, Ruth finds herself in the fields of this stud named Boaz. And we pick up today in Ruth chapter 2, verse 14. Ruth has been spotted in the fields of Boaz, and Boaz notices her and invites her into his home for a meal. In verse 14, we pick up, it says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come over here, have some bread, and dip it into the wine vinegar.' When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over." We are at the point where we're beginning to see this relationship between Ruth and Boaz progress. Can I tell you that whether you are old or young, have dated before or have never dated, maybe you have dated and had horrible relationships, or maybe you are just now in your first relationship. When we learn, when we understand, and when we are guided by God's roadmap for relationships, you and I will begin to find ourselves in relationships that are marked by protection, safety, and health. It's what we begin to see playing out in the story of Ruth. And if we don't learn this for ourselves, we too can end up doing what we see everyone else doing. You may find yourself compromising for less than you deserve, both in your relationships and just in life in general. And today I want to share with you the rest of chapter 2 of Ruth, but more importantly, what I believe are 3 parts to God's roadmap for relationships. 3 parts to God's roadmap for successful, healthy relationships. In the first part, we see God teaching Ruth. God is teaching Ruth to follow God's will. Boaz is this incredibly successful businessman, and Ruth is this Moabite woman who is broke as a joke. Imagine this woman who's been harvesting in fields, just trying to find enough food for her family. She probably doesn't smell all that good. She's probably wearing peasant clothes. Her hair's up in a bun. And she is now sitting in the same dining room as the successful businessman Boaz. This is 3,000 years ago. Context is a little bit different. This is a godly Hebrew man and a Moabite woman. It's important to understand that Hebrews would naturally look down on this woman for 2 reasons. One, she's poor. Right? Like, poor, broke as a joke. Okay? Like, poor. And 2, and maybe more importantly, she's a Moabite woman. She's totally different than them. And so culturally, by inviting her into his home, he is immediately elevating her status. He has invited her into his home, and by doing this, he is saying, this woman is equal to us. She sits at the same table as us. She has the same values as us. She may have come in here different, but she sits at this table, my table, and she is equal here. He is saying we are going to treat her like family. We're going to treat her like she is God's daughter. Scripture says she ate all she wanted. This is how I know me and Ruth would get along. We'd be friends. We'd sit down, we'd have a good meal. Other translations say that she ate until she was satisfied. Remember, Ruth was broke. It had been a while since she had had a good meal and been full. She was likely cashing in on this date, right? She was not ordering a side salad. She went straight for the surf and turf, right? Boaz might as well have put a placard on the door that said Golden Corral open for business, right? Like, it was time for Ruth to eat. And it says that even after she ate all that she could, it says that she had some left over, which I would like to point out stands as the first reference to leftovers or a doggy bag. I just think that's biblically important there in Scripture. We pick up in Ruth chapter 2, verse 15. Ruth is eaten. She has some leftovers, and she gets up to get ready to go back into the field to harvest from the margins of the field. It says that as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. He said, "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to pick up, and do not rebuke her." The law said to leave margins for the marginalized. Brandon talked about this last week. Now, what Boaz is doing is significant. You've got to catch the significance in what he has just allowed this woman to do. He says, let's go beyond the law. Let's show this woman how much we notice her. Let's show this woman how much we care for her. Let's show her how equal she is to us. We're not going to just go beyond the law. Let's go beyond what is expected. Let's go into unexpected generosity. Don't just give her from the edges. Let her go to the middle of the harvest and let her take what is the best that the harvest has to supply. And not even that, but he orders his men to go do half of the work for her. That's generosity. You want to know the definition of generosity? He goes above and beyond the requirements of the law. He goes beyond what is expected. He goes into unexpected generosity. Let's keep reading in Ruth chapter 2:17. She gathers the things. Ruth gleaned from the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered. It amounted to about 1 ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. And Ruth also brought out and gave what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So Boaz and Ruth have their first meal together. He sends her back out. She gets food, the best of the harvest. Can I also add a little side note here? I think we're going to add a little bit of importance on the importance of the first date. Okay? Gentlemen, look your best. Be on your best behavior. Chivalry is alive. Amen? Okay? But look at this story up to this point. You want to tell me that God's will did not come into play in this story? That God's will is not the greatest thing in charge as we read through this story. Here is this successful, godly businessman. And here is this downtrodden, broke, hopeless Moabite woman who is in a land that she doesn't even really know. Ruth leaves Moab with Naomi to go to Bethlehem. She could have gleaned from any field in the land. And she just happens to show up at Boaz. She happens to be working when Boaz happens to show up. Boaz happens to notice her. Boaz happens to have a heart for her. He happens to invite her in for a meal. And when you read about the quality of man that Boaz is, the quality of this godly man, it reminds you that there are different levels of quality when it comes to the relationships that you can have. When I think about it, I think that there's 3 kinds of people when it comes to relationship. There are takers. I see it often, unfortunately. People get into relationships, and the relationship to them is all about what you can give me. What do you have that I can take? Not just financially, but emotionally, sometimes physically. There are debtors. They operate with this understanding that what I give to you, you owe me in return. I will give to you, but what I give, you owe me in return. And then, church, there are givers. There are the people like Boaz. Boaz doesn't owe her anything. And yet, the generosity that he shows her is extravagant. But I have some respect for Ruth here, because she doesn't just find herself a giver. We start to read that Ruth herself is a giver. Church, don't just find a giver, be a giver. Look at what Ruth does. She goes home after dinner and she brought back to Naomi an ephah of barley. I don't know if you know what an ephah is, but it's about 30 pounds worth of barley. So she's coming back in with her arms full. This would be about 2 weeks worth of wages. Ruth goes out and works really hard for one day and makes 2 weeks worth of wages. Can we just all sign up for that job right now? I mean, come on, please. Boaz stands out as this incredibly generous man. Can I tell you, church, that relationships flourish between people who are generous? Relationships flourish when two givers give to each other. You may not be able to give what others can give, but man, I would challenge you to find a way to enrich others by what you can give. Ruth knows that she cannot give the way that Boaz gives, but Ruth gains and she gives